you to today's featured speaker. Rima Touré-Tillery is Associate Professor of Marketing at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. She holds a PhD from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Her research is at the intersection of motivation and self-perception with implications for marketers, managers, educators, and public policymakers. She uses experimental and survey methods to examine two key drivers of motivation: the perception of self-diagnosticity, the extent to which people believe an action is indicative of the type of person they are, and the illusion of impact, the extent to which people believe an action contributes to the attainment of their goal. Rima's research investigates a wide range of self-regulatory behaviors such as charitable donations, ethical consumption, healthy eating, saving, voting, and cheating. Her work has produced peer-reviewed articles in top marketing and psychology journals, such as the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the Journal of Marketing, and the Journal of Experimental Psychology. And she is also featured in several media outlets, such as the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, The New Yorker, and the Boston Globe. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rima today to talk to us about how to engage and motivate your customers. Rima?
Thank you, Earl. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to be here today, and I hope everyone is doing well and feeling great. In our audience today, I'm told that we have people from different parts of the world, and as you know, our differences in cultures and background have tremendous influences on our daily lives and choices, but there are also some universal truths about human behavior and motivation. And understanding these truths can not only help us create and maintain successful brands, but it can also help us understand ourselves, because we're all consumers after all, from the time we're born, from that first diaper to the jeans we wear now, or maybe pajama pants in these days. So I hope that this course will also be a journey of self-discovery in some ways. So let's start the journey in the 1980s. In 1983, Pepsi is gaining ground nationally and internationally, and they're claiming that their product, Pepsi, tastes better than Coke in blind taste tests. They even have a bunch of commercials to prove it, and I'm going to show you one of those.
This is the taste. This is the test. Pepsi versus Coke, the Pepsi Challenge. Pepsi. And all across America, more people pick Pepsi. Time after time after time.
Pepsi Cola.
Oh, what a time. It's gonna be Pepsi now. The winning taste is Pepsi. It's gonna be Pepsi now. Taste what Pepsi's giving. It's gonna be Pepsi now.
Pretty cool ad, right? This is very 80s also. So this worries Coca-Cola to no end, and you can understand why. So first, the company investigates Pepsi's claims, and unable to disprove it, they decide that they're going to design a version of Coke that's going to be better than Pepsi and also better than Coke. So the research initiative here was massive, including focus groups and hundreds of thousands of blind taste tests. And eventually, after 2 years, they did it. They came up with a miracle product that tasted better than Pepsi. 56% of people preferred this new product to Pepsi. And the product tasted even better than Coke itself. 55% of people preferred this new product to Coke. So they called it New Coke, of course, and launched it in April of 1985. And it didn't go so well. In fact, it was kind of a national crisis. People protested in the street. You had people holding signs saying things like, "Our children will never know refreshment." It was serious. Headquarters were flooded with calls and letters, 8,000 calls a day, over 40,000 letters a day, back when people used to write letters. So in July, only 3 months later, Coca-Cola decided that maybe it would be a good idea to go back to the old Coke. Except they couldn't call it Old Coke, so it became Coke Classic. So why do you think this went wrong? I mean, think about it for a minute. There are many explanations floating around, and of course, hindsight is 20/20. But I'm going to give you two possible reasons. One is the metric. This obsession with blind taste tests as a metric for success. And the reason for that is that people do not necessarily consume Coke or Pepsi in small sips without knowing what they're drinking. And so this particular metric may not have simulated the full consumption experience, right? something that you like in a small sip may not be as palatable in a 12-ounce can. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that the company may have failed to realize that people were really attached to the idea of Coke more than to taste even. And as we know from research and from personal experience, people form attachment to brands, concepts, colors, smells, sounds, you name it. And to the point that one of the executives on the project in the 80s, the New Coke project, said that talking to people about changing Coke was almost like saying you were going to make the flag prettier. So in retrospect, kind of crazy. Now, there were several studies involving this comparison between Coke and Pepsi after this event, right? Many of these studies found that in taste tests, a large number of people preferred Coke to Pepsi. And the difference is that this time, the taste tests were not blind. People knew what they were drinking. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is that understanding consumer behavior and motivation is critical to new product development and to sustaining existing products and brands. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. First, we'll talk about consumer behavior and motivation, what motivates people to engage with brands or services. Then we'll talk about the perceptual process and what are some perceptual factors and biases that can get in the way of keeping consumers engaged. So let's start with two definitions. First, motivation. Motivation is the force that drives actions towards a goal. This is what makes you take steps to achieve your goal. And a goal is a desired end state. This is where you want to be when it's all said and done. Having a goal creates a state of tension, a discrepancy between where you are now and where you want to be. And people have many goals. This is a survey of 2,000 adults last year and shows the top 10 goals of US adults in that year. Now, if you take a minute to stop and think about your own goals, for every goal you have, there's most likely a product or service that can help you achieve that goal or that claims to be able to help you achieve that goal. And that's because marketers work hard to create new products and communicate about these products and services that can help consumers achieve their goals. But people do not always act in accordance with their goals, right? Just because you have a goal to stick to your budget doesn't mean that you'll always stick to your budget. So what motivates people to stick to their goals? The importance of the goal is important, right? I'm more likely to stick to my budget if that's a really important goal to me than if it's not an important goal. But people do not always act in accordance with their important goals. Even if sticking to my budget is important to me, I might still not stick to it all the time. So again, what motivates consumers? There are three broad categories of factors or drivers of motivation. And these are factors that increase people's motivation to act toward their goal. Let's call them the 3 E's of motivation: effectiveness, enjoyment, and ego. And we're going to go through these one at a time. So let's start with the first one, effectiveness. Basic idea here is that consumers want results. The principle is that people will be more motivated to act and engage with a brand when they believe that it will have the desired effect, that it will work, that they'll get a reward, money, food, fame, friends, or any combination of those things as outcomes of pursuing the goal. This is also called extrinsic motivation. And marketers work really hard to convince consumers that their products, services, and brands will be effective. We use credible spokespersons, entertainment, repetition, humor, social proof, scientific proof, and so on and so forth. The messaging by Snickers here, for example, are very effective at doing that. Like, if you're hungry, grab a Snickers bar. You're hungry, grab a Snickers bar. So we hear this a lot and we make this association. And the basic idea is that if you're hungry, eating a Snickers bars will make you less hungry, right? So this is really a good illustration of highlighting this effect principle. There are many factors that can give people a sense that they'll reach their goal, that they'll be effective, right? One of them is using a product that claims to be effective at helping you reach that goal. Another is believing in yourself. This is also called self-efficacy. The idea that you can reach your goals can make you more likely to reach your goals. And Nike's messaging is a good example of this notion. I'm going to show you another ad.
She's pushing on again, and she's breaking away. She's going for something special.
Would it be easier for you if I wasn't so fast? Will it be simpler if I stopped winning? Would you be more comfortable if I was less proud? Will you prefer I hadn't worked so hard? Or just didn't run? Or chose a different sport? Or stopped at my first steps? That's too bad, because I was born to do this.
He does it again. Semenya takes the win and won it.
So this ad features Caster Semenya. Many of you might know she's a formidable Olympic athlete who faced many challenges, starting with humble beginnings in South Africa to harassment by some who questioned whether she was actually a woman. So Nike's messages here is that if she can do it, so can you, and believing in yourself is important.
Hi, Rima. I'm sorry to jump in here, but we're getting a few chats about the level of your volume. Would you mind speaking up and maybe a little bit closer to the mic if you're able to?
Of course. Is this better?
That is better.
Well, let's try this. Hopefully this is better. So as you can see, you can get the confidence internally. You're just born confident in certain domains, or you can get it through products. And one example is that Nike will help you perform at a high level because of the quality. Another thing that makes a product seem more effective is specialization. So a specialized product or service avoids what's called the dilution effect. This is because people perceive products, services, or brands that try to do too many different things as less effective at doing each one of those things. And this really highlights the challenges in brand extension, like, for example, Harley Davidson not so successfully attempting to make perfumes. Of course, you want to extend your brand where it makes sense. So, for example, if you're Colgate and you're well known for toothpastes, it might make sense to make toothbrushes. But what about frozen dinners? Maybe not. Another effective way to communicate about effectiveness is through metaphors. And metaphors work really well because our conceptual system, the way that we think about things, is largely metaphorical in nature. So we tend to think about one thing in terms of another. I'm going to show you another example of an ad that uses metaphors in a not so subtle way. Let's see if you catch the metaphor here.
A few weeks ago, I was having problems staying regular. I felt sluggish. It even affected the way I worked. Something had to give. So I tried the all-brand 10-day challenge. And I'll tell you what, it worked. Once a day, 10 days. The taste is great. I felt invigorated, and my energy came back. Tell you what, somebody offers you 10 days to a better you, you take it.
The all-brand 10-day challenge. Do it, feel it.
So did you catch the metaphor here? For those of you who missed it, the idea is that all brand helps you with constipation, and the many falling objects in the ad represented improving bowel movements. Let's just leave it at that. So now let's get out of the bathroom and talk about the second E, enjoyment. The principle of enjoyment is that people want to have fun. Consumers are more motivated to do something, to use a brand, to engage with a brand, if they believe that they'll derive some enjoyment, pleasure, or satisfaction from the process of pursuing that goal. This is also called intrinsic motivation. I'm going to stop for a minute and make sure that everybody can hear me. Is this better? Okay. So marketers of fun and indulgent products don't have to work too hard to highlight enjoyment. So if I'm selling chocolates, it's easy to tell people that you will enjoy eating this chocolate. But this can be trickier for marketers of products or services that are about inherently hard to do things and not so fun things to do, like working out for some people or doing your taxes. So this TurboTax ad that I'm going to show you is a good illustration of how a not so inherently enjoyable thing can be made to seem enjoyable using this enjoyment principle. Let's take a look.
Ayo, Lena, it's Chad. Did you hear? My app just got massive funding.
Oh, wow, really? Tell me more.
Okay. I call it the Catculator. It's a calculator, but for your cat. Meow. I just got the idea when my cat stepped on my calculator.
Oh, thank goodness.
Hi, Lena. Is now a good time to go through your tax return line by line together?
Yeah, line by line sounds awesome, and please, take your time. It's my CPA, so I have to take this.
Give me a call. Talk.
I won't, but thanks.
Awesome. Talk then. Hey, Stacy.
TurboTax Live, now with CPAs on demand.
So the idea is that doing your taxes may not be the most fun thing you can do, but it can be more fun than talking to Chad. Talking about this enjoyment principle again, research shows that people work hard at what they enjoy, right? So there's a lot of research showing, for example, that people who enjoy doing certain things are more motivated to pursue those things, and their performance is better in various contexts, academic contexts and fitness contexts, right? If I like studying, then I'm going to perform better at studying, and so on and so forth. But not everyone enjoys studying or eating vegetables or working out. So what should they do? Well, these researchers at the University of Chicago show that simply focusing on aspects of the task that you enjoy or adding an enjoyable component to a not so enjoyable task can do the trick. So in one of their studies, for example, they had participants randomly assigned to two groups. In one group, they gave participants carrots or vegetables and asked them to focus on the enjoyment of eating these vegetables. The other group was told to focus on the effectiveness of eating these vegetables for their health goals and so on and so forth. And what they found is that the people who focused on enjoyment ate more vegetables than the people who focused on effectiveness. In another study with high schoolers, they found that students worked harder on a geometry and statistics test when the experience was made slightly more enjoyable with light music and snacks and colorful pens. So students who were in that room performed better than students who did not have these things to make the experience more enjoyable. So marketers try to show that their products are going to be fun and enjoyable, or will make not so fun activities more fun. So for example, listening to a book on Audible might make your workout more exciting. And that's what this ad on the top right corner is telling us. But sometimes we will do things even if they are not enjoyable, just because they will make us feel good about ourselves or look good in general, right? And this is where the third E comes in, ego. The idea of ego is that people want to feel good about themselves. Right? It's not necessarily about being selfish, but it's about wanting to look good and feel good about oneself. And the principle is that people will be more likely to do something if it makes them look good and feel good about themselves. Consumers want to see themselves as cool, smart, sophisticated, a variety of things. And brands can strive to be seen as that thing to make the consumer feel that way by association. And by the way, metaphors work here too, right? So these headphones are dripping with style, and presumably walking around with those will make you more stylish. Another way to make consumers look good and feel good about themselves is to build a social connection to a connection to a social cause that they care about. So I have a few examples here with Gillette supporting the Me Too movement with the controversial toxic masculinity ads. We have Tom's of Maine in the middle, protecting the environment. And we have on the top right corner, L'Oreal supporting equal pay for women. And so these are ways in which consumers can relate to the brand in a way that makes them feel good about themselves for associating with that brand. So having one or more of these three E's, effectiveness, enjoyment, ego, has the potential to increase consumers' motivation to act toward a goal and engage with the brands that support these goals. Now, it's important to note here that different consumers have different goals. And that's why segmentation is so important, right? Segmenting your market to identify those consumers whose goals match your offerings. So different consumers have different goals, but the same consumers can also have different goals at different points in time. People's priorities can evolve naturally over time or change in response to an event, like the current crisis with the coronavirus. crises like these do not change the fundamentals of human behavior or consumer motivation. What they do is shift consumers' goals and focus to more basic and immediate needs like food and shelter. And with a pandemic, the motivation to stay healthy is going to be particularly salient, right? There's a lot of work in the domain of health motivation and health communication. And basically this work tells us that health motivation starts with an assessment of the threat of the disease, in this case. How serious is the disease? So this is an assessment of the severity of the disease. How likely am I to catch it personally? And this is an assessment of my own vulnerability. And with these two assessments, if I believe the disease is severe and that I'm vulnerable to it, then I'm going to be more likely to take it seriously. And that makes health motivation an important goal for me. And once a consumer decides that it's important for them to protect themselves, then the 3 E's apply to this context as well. With effectiveness, for example, people will be more motivated to protect themselves and take the steps necessary to do so. Like in the case of COVID, washing your hands, don't touch your face, stay isolated, clean regularly. People will be more motivated to do these things if they believe that they can do it, if they have the self-efficacy to do it. They'll also be more motivated to do those things if they believe that it works. Will it actually protect me from COVID-19 to wash my hands, not touch my face, stay isolated and clean regularly, right? And this is called response efficacy. So the effectiveness of these steps is going to be absolutely critical. And here are some examples of recent communications about COVID that highlight you can help prevent the spread. It's in your hands. And these communications are meant to convey a sense of effectiveness, that yes, you can do it and it will be effective. For enjoyment, people will be more motivated to protect themselves if they believe it won't be too painful. I mean, it's not fun protecting oneself from a disease, not necessarily. It may not be fun to wash your hands all the time, dry hands, not touching your face is hard. Apparently we touch our faces a lot. Staying isolated is difficult, and cleaning everything regularly is also difficult. But the idea is that it's not fun, but it doesn't have to be too unpleasant. And we see some examples of communications here that try to kind of use this principle of enjoyment. Washing your hands doesn't have to be painful. If you, for example, here, the public health tip is if you aren't sure how long to wash your hands, just remember Lady Macbeth's speech, right? So that's another way to make it fun. There are lots of tips on social media about what song to sing while you're washing your hands. In the middle, you see an ad about how to make staying at home fun. Staying at home is not so bad. You can go riding your bike. You can read books and so on and so forth. And then on the right side, you have how to have fun with not shaking hands, right? So you have the elbow, the wave, and so on and so forth. And these are really good illustrations of the enjoyment principle. And finally, with ego, people, again, are motivated to take steps if it makes them look good and feel good about themselves, right? And there's some messaging out there that illustrate this quite well. So at the top, you'll see, this is an ad called, an app, a location app called Zenly. And this app has started a challenge to see who can stay home the longest, right? So you're competing with your friends to see who's staying home the most. And that is a good boost for feeling good about yourself if winning the competition by staying home. You see at the bottom, stay home, stop the spread, save lives. Basically, you're a hero if you stay home. And wash your hands and don't be a racist. And that's what good people do, right? And so these are all good examples of the ego principle in this case. So you can see that regardless of the goal, the 3 E's apply. And highlighting one or more of these E's has the potential to increase people's motivation to act toward a goal and engage with the brands that can help them fulfill these goals. And brands compete to capitalize on consumer motivation. But first, consumers must notice them. And that's not always as straightforward as you might think. So, we learn about brands and products and services through exposure to marketing information, but we don't always passively process that information. A lot of things happen in the middle before we actually get the meaning of that information. I'm going to show you an ad that does a really good job of illustrating this.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Don't believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so. So there we have it. Proof that the new Skoda Fabia is truly attention-stealing.
So as you can see, it's not that straightforward. We notice only a small proportion of the information in our environment. And when I say marketing information, I'm talking about ads, products, and services, and anything related to a brand, experiences, and so on. And we notice only a small proportion of that information. And that's just because there's just too much of it out there, especially in today's marketplace. And our attentional resources are limited on top of all this. Then, of the information that we notice, we attend to an even smaller proportion. And then when we attend to this information, we process the information in a biased manner. And sometimes if it's too threatening, in the case of health information and talking about diseases that can kill you, we either avoid the information and don't even look at it, or we convince ourselves that it doesn't apply to us. So there are lots of things that get in the way of really getting messages through. For starters, our mental and attentional resources are limited, so our brain prioritizes without asking us permission. So for example, most of the time, our brains will prioritize visual information over auditory information. There's a very well-known effect called the Mcgurk Effect, where you basically only focus on what a person's mouth or lips are sounding rather than on the sound that they're making. I'm just going to show you a quick clip of that.
Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba.
So in the first part of this video, the man is vocalizing the sound ba. That makes sense. In the second part of the video, he also sounds like he's vocalizing the sound fa, but in fact he's saying ba. So the whole time what's being said is ba, 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 but because he looks like he's saying fa in the second part of the video, we hear fa. So we're really focused on this visual information that we're getting and how he's forming those sounds. And pharmaceutical ads are another good example of this principle. You get so wrapped up in the visual storytelling of a person walking and going about their busy lives that you might not hear the side effects, for example, at the end of the ad. All right, now let's do a quick exercise. I'm going to show you some words on the screen right here, at the very bottom. And I'm going to ask you to do, what I'm going to ask you to do is say out loud to yourselves the color in which the word is written. Don't read the word itself, but just say the color that you see. So I don't know about you, but it was really hard for me. I said yellow, blue, orange, black, right? And this is because meaning really dominates color in this case. This is an example of the Stroop effect, where it's really hard to separate ourselves from what the word yellow that we see and just focus on the color of the yellow. So again, in this case, this is another example of how our brain prioritizes and in this case prioritizes meaning over, in this case, the color. Let's look at another example. Which orange circle is larger? To me, it looks like the one on the right is larger. This is because the one on the right is surrounded by smaller gray circles when the one on the left is surrounded by larger circles. So my brain is telling me this is obviously larger than this one, when in fact these two circles are exactly the same size. Tversky and Kahneman are two psychologists who spend much of their work identifying these types of biases in judgment and decision making. For example, they've identified something called the availability heuristic, the anchoring effect, you may have heard of those, the framing effect, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is talk about each one of those separately. But first, let me ask you a question. Which of these two things is a most likely cause of death in the United States? Being killed by an airplane, by airplane parts falling from the sky, or being killed by a shark? For most people, the answer is going to be shark, when in fact, it's the opposite. In the US, the chances of dying from falling airplane parts is 30 times greater than the chances of dying from a shark attack. But of course, both of these are very low in probability. So I don't want you to walk away from here with another thing to worry about. So falling airplane parts, the odds of being killed by falling airplane parts are 1 in 10 million. Very low odds. And those of being killed by a shark attack are 1 in 264 million. So much higher, but still very low. So that's an example of the availability heuristic. Because we can easily remember instances of hearing about somebody being killed by a shark, either on the news or through the movie that we've seen, we judge the event as more likely. And exposure to news, as I said, can have a great influence on our ease of recalling information and thinking, if I can remember it easily, then it's definitely very, very frequent. There are many examples in the marketplace of using this principle. For example, eHarmony ads show you a lot of married couples. And so the idea is that when you think eHarmony, you think married couples. And so the belief that if you use eHarmony, you're likely to get married. Gyms also will show you a lot of muscular people, again, for the same principle. Then you have Allstate ads showing you that bad stuff happens all the time with the Mayhem series of ads. Just a sort of keeping that top of mind, making you more likely to think about buying insurance. A second heuristic here is called the anchoring effect. And the anchoring effect is a cognitive bias that makes people rely too heavily on an initial piece of information that they get when making a decision. So here's an example. So I see these shoes and they cost $300. I might think, well, $300 is a lot for these shoes. I'm not going to buy these shoes. It's too much. But then if I saw this instead, these shoes used to cost $1,000 and now they're $300. All of a sudden, $300 seems like a pretty good deal. That's an example of the anchoring effect because I'm using that $1,000 to assess the $300. The framing effect is another of those cognitive biases. It is where people decide on options based on if the option is presented in a positive or negative frame semantically, right? As a loss or as a gain. So for example, if you look here, you'll have at the top, frozen yogurt, 20% fat, doesn't sound so good, but 80% fat-free sounds better. Same with the chicken at the bottom, 90% lean, sounds good, 10% fat, not so good, right? It sounds better when it's in a positive frame. The scarcity heuristic is basically the idea that things that are rare have more value. So indicating, for example, in this, the ad at the top, that only 4 of these jackets are left in stock might make somebody more likely to buy it because people don't want to miss out. We have FOMO, fear of missing out. And so knowing that something is scarce or rare or that we might not have it and it's a limited time, a special offer, makes us more likely to engage with that thing. And we're seeing that today, right? With toilet paper, hashtag toilet paper panic, Papergate, and so on. And so the idea here is that people realize that if they're going to have to stay home for a while, they're going to need toilet paper and they might run out. And so the fear of running out makes us buy a lot of toilet paper. And then other people see us buying a lot of toilet paper and they buy a lot of toilet paper. Then we see them buying a lot of toilet paper and we buy more. And then people see empty shelves, which are a really good way to communicate scarcity. And seeing empty shelves make people panic and look for more toilet paper. And this is the scarcity principle in action here. You also have the in-group bias. This is a natural tendency for people to favor those who belong to their group. And this is true to various types of groups: race, ethnicity, religion, hometown, sports team, same high school, and so on and so forth, and even operating system, right? And so brands often encourage the creation of these kinds of groups. I'm a Mac, you're a PC. Even something as trivial as left Twix and right Twix at the very bottom, right? So encouraging people to choose a group makes them more likely to be loyal to that group and to favor that group and to be consistently engaged with that group. The last one I'm going to show you is the representativeness heuristic. So the idea of the representativeness heuristic is that if two things look similar, then they're the same. And so I can apply what I know about the category to all things in this category. And so, for example, if you look at the brands on the screen, on the right side of the screen, what do these brands have in common? Well, they all look like they're French. They kind of sound like French brands. And we have some ideas about what a French brand is like. They're stylish, they're high quality, when in fact here there's only one of these brands that's French, Coco Chanel. But because these look like French brands, we might treat them as if they were a French brand and attribute to them a certain level of style or quality or whatever it is that we associate with a French brand. So this is an example of how our expectations can really shape our reality. Let's look at one last example. If I say, let's do some math, what you'll see here is the number 13, right? 12, 13, 14. If I say, let's solve some anagrams, then all of a sudden you're seeing potentially B, A, B, C, right? So is it 13 or is it B? This is a really good example of how our goals can determine how we interpret reality, right? Each person is going to interpret information in a way that's consistent with his or her unique biases, experiences, and goals, and different people have different goals. So we see this symbol here, and we attend to it, and we interpret it based on our goals, either as a B or as a 13. So this concludes today's session. I want to conclude with a recap of what we learned today. So we learned the 3 E's of motivation: effectiveness, enjoyment, ego, and how these influence our behavior. We learned that information is filtered through the perceptual system, and that our attentional resources are limited, and that our goals really influence how we interpret information. We also learned that different people have different goals, different motives, which makes strategic marketing management using segmentation, targeting, and positioning particularly important. And doing these things require a solid understanding of consumer behavior and motivation. And my hope is that this session has contributed to solidifying your understanding of consumer motivation. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Rima. I want to remind the audience that if you have questions, you can at the bottom of your screen. And a couple of you did that, and of course, now I'm going to address those, and then maybe we'll get into a few others if you care to share those.
Earl, I'm having a really hard time hearing you. This is Rima, I'm sorry. Earl, I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
All right, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Again, thanks very much for a great presentation, some good comments along the way and questions. Some time back, Chandra had a question about very much accepting the framework you're sharing and the point of view, wondering how this would differ perhaps depending on the medium of the communication. And she specifically asked about, say, content marketing. Which of these principles might be more salient of the 3 E principles when you're engaging with something like content marketing? Just your thoughts about that.
I'm sorry, but I could not hear the question. Seems to be a delay or an echo in what you're saying, Earl. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, is that better?
Much better.
Okay, so I'm sorry about that. Again, thanks again for your presentation. There was a question from Chandra about how this principles might apply differently in a different context, a medium like content marketing. Your thoughts about which of the principles of the 3E principles might be most salient when you're trying to reach out to customers through content marketing?
So what I would say is that these principles, either one of these principles can apply in any context. It really depends on what goals we're looking at and what goals consumers have when they get onto your website or get into that engagement or interaction with your brand, and which of these principles would be most sort of relevant for that context. But I wouldn't say that it would be different depending on the type of marketing you're doing or the type of context or even the type of goal here.
Okay, another question that came up, or maybe more of a challenge, I suppose. Mola was saying that perhaps these 3 principles would be very different under the circumstances that we're currently in, the kind of crisis mode that consumers are in. And I wonder if you maybe could just revisit briefly your belief and the reasons for believing that these 3 principles hold even in the type of situation we find ourselves today.
That's a really good question. So what I've highlighted here is that the 3 E's, or these sort of fundamental motivators or drivers of motivation, will apply to most contexts, right? So the example I gave is in a context where people were worried about their health, they're worried about their, staying alive. What happens in these contexts is that it's not so much that the principles do not apply, it's more that the goals change. We're applying the same principles to different kinds of goals. So goals here might be to have enough food at home to avoid catching COVID-19. And the idea, once these goals become important, the likelihood that we're going to engage in the behaviors that will help us reach these goals will still rely on very similar principles, right? So the example I gave of with COVID-19 is that, convincing people to protect themselves would be more likely, would be easier if one of these 3 E's is satisfied. Is it effective? If you tell me to wash my hands, avoid other people, stay isolated, these are not things necessarily that are easy to do, but if I know that they're effective and this is a really good way to protect myself, then I'm more likely to do it. It's not easy if you tell me that, well, it doesn't have to be unpleasant. That's another way that I'm motivated to actually engage in these steps. And also feeling good about myself and looking good is also an important motivator in this context of knowing that if I'm doing this, I'm saving lives. I may not be saving my own life, but I might be saving someone else's life, somebody who's more vulnerable to this virus.
Okay, that's great. Let me consolidate a few questions that came in with a very similar idea, I think, and that is how these principles might play out in different categories or different type of decisions. For obvious reasons, your examples were drawn from the healthcare realm and pharmaceuticals and personal well-being, but maybe just your examples or thoughts of how these principles would be a little bit different in different product categories. And let me add to that, if there are, and one of the other questions that came up with whether this varies maybe by things like demographics, age, gender. Do you find that some of these principles are more salient for certain demographic groups, and should that be part of your consideration when you're developing appropriate messaging?
That's a really good question. So, so what I would say is I don't have any specific research showing which principle is more effective for which demographic. What I would say is that I would expect all demographics to be motivated in different ways by each of these principles. And again, one thing to keep in mind is that one principle may be more applicable to a certain context, to a certain audience, right? So if you're thinking about enjoyment, and you might, this is a principle that you might not want to use in some contexts. If you're trying to convince people to go to have colonoscopies, for example, you might not, it might be hard to sell an enjoyment principle in this case. So other principles might apply more and might be easier, might make more sense. So although each one of these principles has the potential of increasing motivation, they have to make sense in the context in which you are operating.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Let me just mention, several people have inquired at various points about whether the slides will be available. And Rima has agreed to make a version of her presentation available in the form of slides. You'll be able to access those through a link that we'll be sending attendees later. And the entire webinar itself will be archived and on our website for future viewing. So within a day or so, you should be able to share a link that will allow your colleagues to watch the archived version of this webinar. One of the questions that came up from Suresh just now was if there are any insights from neuroscience that maybe help explain and bear on some of these principles you've been sharing. Just kind of curious how that literature might relate to some of the principles that you shared and maybe elaborate on that a bit.
That's a good question. One thing that comes to mind when it comes to neuroscience is a study that was done, and I'm sure that there are works out there that I don't know off the top of my head, but one experiment I remember is one that was done by researchers at Baylor College of Medicine in Texas, and this is related to the new Coke example that I gave. And so they did a study where they found that when people are exposed to a Coke can as opposed to a Pepsi can, there's much more activation in the part of their brains that are associated with self-image and memory than when they're exposed to a can of Pepsi. And so this was another example, another way to show that the can makes a difference. The brand itself makes a difference, and that one thing that Coke was missing in that in switching to New Coke was this brand equity that they had. But from to answer this question, what I'll say is that this is an example of how you know, the ego principle might apply, right? Or where I associate Coke so much with my self-image and my memories and so on and so forth, that the idea of changing it is almost like changing myself. And so that's the best illustration I can think about right now. But my guess is that there are more out there, ways of showing how.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, obviously, it's pretty expensive to do some of these neuroscience studies, but I would imagine there are other more conventional ad assessment techniques that you could use to determine to what extent a particular communication is engaging the ego or the efficacy or the enjoyment aspect of the message. In other words, it's nice to have that validation from the neuroscan, but there are probably some of the traditional techniques we use to determine ad effectiveness and copy testing and so forth would help elicit what is working on those 3 E's in a given communication.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
This is a somewhat humorous question, but Pamela asked, going back to the Colgate extension example, that it didn't extend into frozen foods, how can you explain the fact that the Ralston Purina company makes food for both people and pets?
That's a good example. That's a good question. I would say people love their pets and feel very, very committed to their pets, and pets are a member of the family, and that could be one reason why Purina can do that. So that would be my guess.
That's a great response. I think you're on to something too. Just getting a question here from Mark. Let me see. How does goal achievement relate to the feelings of reward or enjoyment? Do some of these lead to more enduring rewards than others? So in other words, something that engages the ego, would that maybe have a longer lasting impact than something that provided, say, more momentary enjoyment?
That's a really good question. So something that engages, I use the term reward mostly in the effectiveness principle, right? So there's a reward at the end of the line, and I'm going to be more motivated to pursue it because I know it will get me to that reward. But you're absolutely right that feeling good about oneself and feeling looking good is also a reward in and of itself, which can be both long-term and short-term. But I would say it's probably more of a short-term reward, right? I might feel good about myself in the moment about something specific, But then later something else will happen and it will go away and I'll need more something else to feel better about myself. So I would say that that's probably more of a reward that fluctuates more. If I get a reward, or if I get a $500 from doing something, then that's might last a little bit long, but also would be somewhat temporary. So I would say most of these rewards would vary in the extent to which they're long lasting or temporary.
That makes sense. Another question from Janice about whether it's possible to sort of engage more than one E at a time, and would that be better? Now, in other words, you shared some examples earlier where too busy a message or too much of an extension dilutes the effect. Do these sort of reinforce each other, or would it be better to focus primarily on one of the E's and then the others maybe not as much? So can you do more than one E at a time, I guess is the question.
That's a very good point. That's a very good question. So you can do more than one E at the same time. In fact, the more E's you do, the better, of course, right? So if you can engage people both in terms of effectiveness, enjoyment, and ego all at once in an incredible way, that would be more powerful. And so actually here, one of the examples I had was of a communication that engaged two E's instead of one. So you can see here it engages enjoyment and ego. So this idea of competing with others to stay home. So there's something that can be enjoyable, but it's also something that can make me feel good about myself if I win. So absolutely, you can use more than one principle at once.
An anonymous attendee asked the question about how you explain a brand like Supreme, and I might add another one would be perhaps Virgin, which can, in his example here, or this example said, can sell brick, t-shirt, fire extinguishers, and chocolate. Is this replicable, and what is the core marketing, something like that? So I guess the notion of what some people may have called a master brand, or a brand that seems to extend across very diverse categories. Any insights about how the 3 E principles might apply there?
So that's a good question. I think I would say, I might not be able to explain all of that, but one thing could be that these are brands that have a high degree of loyalty, and people associate the brand itself so much that it can be used for anything, right? And those might be a few examples of that a brand stands for more than just the product that it makes, and that might allow a brand to branch out in a variety of contexts.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here, I think. We've been a very lively session, and I want to thank Rima again, and I thank our audience for some good questions, and had a really good turnout. And most folks, again, apologies for the sound quality at the beginning, but I hope most were able to hear and see the presentation. We will be sending an email follow-up with links to the set of slides that Rima has agreed to release to attendees, and the webinar itself will be archived on our website. So I want to again thank all of you for being with us. Under the circumstances, I think this is going to be more and more the way we engage our wide audience of corporate members and others in the marketing community. So we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. And I just want to remind you all that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you at a future lunch lecture at MSI webinars soon.